Well, hello everyone, and let's wait for people to come in before we actually start off this presentation. Okay, I guess more people will keep coming in. We will start off the presentation right away. A very warm welcome to all of you gentlemen, all gentlemen over here. Welcome Olav Sorensen and Geoffrey Borchhardt, who are presenting their paper today, Entrepreneurship as the Safe Option, Evidence from India. And we have Maurizio Bussolo, who will be the discussant. A brief introduction of the presenters. Olav Sorensen is the Joseph Jacobs Chair in Entrepreneurial Studies, Professor of Strategy, Faculty Research Director, Price Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at UCLA Anderson School of Management. I hope I got that right, Olav. If anything is wrong, you may correct me. And Geoffrey Borchhardt is at Yale University. He is a PhD candidate at the Yale School of Management, working on organizations and management. And he was earlier at the University of Oxford and Copenhagen Business School as well. So welcome both of you. Maurizio Bussolo, some people will be, many of them will be familiar with him. He has made a presentation at this webinar already. This is the 21st webinar, and he was there in an earlier one in January 2021, if I'm right. And he had a presentation which was very similar, not exactly the same, as the ones presented by Olav and Geoffrey today. He is the Deputy Chief Economist, South Asia, World Bank. That's my brief introduction to all the participants today. I'll now hand over to Geoffrey to start the presentation. Over to you, Geoffrey.
All right. Can you see my slides? Okay. Fantastic. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming to our presentation. We are very much looking forward to hearing what all of you think, and are very open to feedback of all sorts, and want to thank Maesh and the organizers for inviting us, and Maurizio for his comments later. And yeah, so like we said, like Maesh said, this paper is currently titled Entrepreneurship as the Safe Option, Evidence from India, and is co-authored work with Olav from UCLA. And to dive right in, the starting point for the study came very much from the literature and this discourse that originates very much in a more Western context. So there's this commonly held notion that entrepreneurship is a risky undertaking. In the US, more than 20% of businesses fail within the first year, and entrepreneurs generally can go a while before they start making an income. And the payoffs that they do earn, if they get some, exhibit very high variance. So something that's inherent in this idea of riskiness is an assumption about the alternative options that are available to you, right? So we might think of a highly educated engineer who starts their own tech startup, or even a small business owner in construction. Like the example on the slides is someone who started their own gutter cleaning company. But both of these people presumably have a more stable employment alternative open to them, because due to the skills that they have and or prior experience, they're likely quite employable in the same or a very similar industry. And so coming at this question from this Western context, we then thought to ask, so what happens if we change the context, and what about the assumptions that go into the literature change and do not hold anymore? And we're specifically interested in contexts in which this assumption about alternative stable employment options might not be available to all or most other people. And essentially this led us to our guiding research question: what are the returns to entrepreneurship in India? So we're going to be talking about returns to entrepreneurship. Does it pay to be self-employed? And we thought that based on all the literature that's out there, which is very much based in and shaped by Western and or non-Western and or rich countries, that this literature was ripe for studying whether it pays to be self-employed in lower or lower middle income economy. And I want to preview our findings just a little bit here before I dive more into the literature. And so what we do in this paper is we document a number of facts, namely that we find strong positive returns to entrepreneurship, returns to self-employment that essentially hold across the board. And this is in contrast to what prior literature from rich countries found. We then go on to show that this is largely driven by self-employment in India, providing more stable income streams and helping people mitigate some of the precarity that they find in paid employment, particularly in the paid employment in the informal sector, paid employment in daily casual wage work. So before we get into all of that, I want to take a step back and talk about the extant literature on returns to entrepreneurship. Like I made clear in sort of the introduction and the setup to this, early research has been very much shaped by the United States, by using the United States as a context in this stream. And it's found higher variance in returns to the earnings of entrepreneurs. So there's some who earn a lot, but a lot who don't, particularly in combination with these lower returns at the median, right? So you can think of this as almost like a high risk, high reward kind of proposition. There are some people who earn a lot more than they otherwise might, otherwise being in paid employment, but there are some, but for the majority, for the average person, they will earn less in self-employment compared to in paid employment. And so this is a slide from one of the early seminal papers this is Bart Hamilton's 2000 paper, Does Entrepreneurship Pay? And in this, he uses data from the US, from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And we very much see this distribution that I described here earlier, right? So the solid line shows the wage earnings of people who work in paid employment, whereas all the various dotted lines get at different ways of measuring the earnings, the income of people who are self-employed. And what we see is that the meat of the distribution of the wage earners, right, is to the right of the self-employed earnings, as in the majority of people makes more in paid employment. But then on the right-hand side, I guess for you, this would be the right-hand side, there's this long tail, and in the tail, the self-employed, there's more self-employed people earning more higher levels of income. So this has been very much, like I said, started in the US, but then also there's been follow-up studies that found very similar patterns that came from other Western or wealthy countries such as Finland or Germany and also Korea. And there's a couple of things to note here. One thing I want to spend just a second on is this idea of self-employment versus entrepreneurship. In the earlier study, in the study by Hamilton that I showed, all of the self-employed were used to proxy for entrepreneurship. There's a bit of a discussion that is to some extent semantic, whether all self-employed are entrepreneurs or whether we should only think about Knightian or Schumpeterian entrepreneurs as specific subsets, and only some of the self-employed are quote unquote real entrepreneurs. And this has somewhat motivated further nuance that then arose in follow-on work, because people went on to find that there are some people, that essentially these people that are in the right-hand tail that earn more and self-employment and in paid employment are different from the rest of the self-employed. And so there's generally consistently been found that there are higher returns for those who build organizations compared to the general self-employed. So these are people who, by some, for example, Levine and Rubenstein, have been found to have different traits. They're what they call smart and illicit, so they generally score higher on standardized test scores, and have also to some extent exhibited illicit tendencies in their youth. But generally, what other people then have coalesced on is that we can use people who start incorporated business as a proxy for these entrepreneurs rather than the general self-employed. Other people have found that there's larger returns for more educated entrepreneurs, or relative returns for more educated people in entrepreneurship, and others have proxied for this idea of building organizations or entrepreneurship by looking at people who found employer businesses, i.e. they don't just make themselves enter self-employment and work for themselves, but they start an organization and they employ other people. And one way that research has made sense of there still being this large swath of people who work in self-employment and earning less than they otherwise could is through this idea of non-pecuniary benefits, right? So there might be things other than financial returns that motivate people to enter entrepreneurship, right? Like perhaps one wants to start their own business because you have a preference for being your own boss. You don't like coming into work at 9 in the morning, but rather only want to start at 11, but therefore work until 7. And if you start your own business, you can control your own hours. Another way that people have sort of started making sense of this general body of the self-employed earning less is through this idea of option values or experimentation. So if you think about this high risk, high reward kind of distribution where you might, a priori, before entering, you don't know whether you're one of the people who's going to be closer to the median, or whether you're one of the people who might earn a lot and perhaps a lot more money in self-employment than you otherwise might in paid employment. So there's this idea that you can try out, experiment, and see whether you are part of the people who earns a lot of money, and just dip your toes in briefly into an entrepreneurial spell. And because you have paid employment as a backup option, if you find out that you're more at the median, that you're earning less than you otherwise would, you can just try entrepreneurship for a few months, for a year, for however long, and then return to paid employment and thereby minimize the risk. But as is sort of the theme of our paper and the theme of this talk, this very much assumes that there is a stable paid employment option to which you can return. And so then, if we think about the context of India specifically, in contrast to this, there is a lot more casual employment, as most of you will be deeply familiar with, compared to a lot of Western countries, right? So, and if we think about casual employment, this might mean that there's no contracts, that there's very few protections, very few legal protections for workers. Agreements might be verbal instead of in writing, and employers, bosses could even renege and sort of withhold pay and have other forms of punishment available to them, essentially. And in practice, this means that there are more people who might be looking for daily or seasonal work, that there might be people who travel into the city, not sure, not knowing if or what kind of work they might do that day. And sort of there's this big number, at least sort of the most recent number I found according to the International Labor Organization, that more than 60% of people in India who work in paid employment engage in casual work. And for reference, and there might still be some definitional discussion to be had here, the European country, or the Western country with the highest number I found was Spain, which still has numbers of only about a third of this. So that is one crucial context, one crucial dimension in which the context is different, and another here being that also, and presumably relatedly, there is over 200 million people in India in self-employment, which vastly exceeds the self-employment rates of Western countries, presumably because many more people are forced into self-employment and are engaging with this not out of an idea of reaping non-pecuniary benefits, but there being a first order problem or question to be solved that is, that is related to earnings, that is related to the question of where one can find higher income. So then we do want to think a little bit about how all of this and how the changed context and what about this affects returns to entrepreneurship, and in what ways do things work differently here. And to start out, it is helpful to think about earnings and returns to entrepreneurship as a function of options that are available to you, right? So if people decide whether they enter entrepreneurship, depending on the options, like at either one's current organization, if there is one, or at the options available in the labor market at large. And these options, in turn, then determine your payoffs, right? So to simplify this to an extreme extent, if the alternative to working in self-employment is unemployment, it doesn't really matter how much you earn in self-employment, because everything will be better than what you would earn as an unemployed person. That said, it's, at least when drawing from the literature and looking at some of the development econ literature, it's not immediately obvious what we should expect a priori. I'm saying it's not immediately obvious, but it's talking about this paper has been interesting in the extent that people who are familiar with the context have been least surprised by it, but other people who come at this from more of a theoretical angle have pushed back much more, and at times not even believed the findings we're getting at to the same extent. But the reason I'm saying that, at least theoretically, it's not immediately obvious what to expect a priori, is that there's a lot more businesses that look like the picture in the background here, right? So this might be someone who sells wares off of the floor or out of a push cart. And these are informal businesses, micro enterprises with very few resources. They might be selling commodities. They have few, if any, employees, or at least few, if any, that aren't family members. And they generally don't enter a market with a specific opportunity to exploit in mind. And all of these are factors that in the development econ and related literatures have been found to be associated with lower profits and lower returns to businesses, right? So there's very much this idea that there are a lot of businesses who have, in other contexts, or even in these contexts, have been found to not be very profitable. So if there's a lot of not very profitable businesses that people start, we might not expect them to earn more than they could in paid employment. On the other hand, and again, this is returning to the theme of the talk, all of this matters very little if the alternative is underemployment. If the alternative to having a non-growth microenterprise is standing in line for work, because then the calculus changes in the extent that even if you only produce relatively cheap homemade goods or offer personal services, then you can control the amount of time that you work, the input into work. So you're still selling goods or wares, and therefore the payoffs that you receive or one receives might vary from day to day, and depending how many people come by and buy from you. But you have a lot more time over which you have control that you can put into your work and which you can sell, and you aren't dependent on other people offering you work, and there's less time spent standing in line or looking for work. And this idea, and I think the one last point I want to make here is that this very much requires a little bit of an option value understanding if we think about how to measure but also conceive of returns to entrepreneurship. If you recall the slide from the Hamilton paper that I showed you at the beginning, this was very much looking at hourly wages, right? And we could conceive of a world in which on an hour-by-hour comparison, here you might earn more in paid employment, or like once you're employed. But if we incorporate the time that is spent looking for work, or like short to intermediate unemployment spells, these are all time periods during which you don't earn anything. So even a lower hourly earnings rate in self-employment might lead to larger returns in the short to medium run, if we think of time spans that are a few weeks or months. Yeah, and so this argument and the way we're thinking about this implies effects that would be strongest for those who are least likely to have stable employment as an alternative. And so these are people who are more likely to start no or low growth businesses, are at the bottom of the income distribution, or perhaps are the least educated also. And sort of in line with prior literature and something related to this distinction between entrepreneurs versus the general self-employed, we can also think about the self-employed writ large here as people of at least 3 different larger categories. And more importantly, for our argument and the way we're thinking about these, the precarity of alternative employment options will vary for these different groups. So essentially, we can think of like one group of people that we might term as growth entrepreneurs. These are more likely to be highly educated, so have fairly good alternative employment options. Still, there's a bit of a question about the extent. So just, I mean, these might be the stereotypical tech entrepreneurs that most people think about when we use the word entrepreneurship, but these could also be people opening up stores or non-innovative businesses that have potential to grow and perhaps, open up second locations and so on and so forth. These are generally, at least from the Western literature, have been found to be more highly educated. And by and large, we should expect positive returns for this group in particular for the same reasons as we do in the Western context. These are more likely to do things like incorporate, grow, employ employees, find market niches, and therefore really grow and be profitable. We can also think about people in agriculture and farming. Quite frankly, this is a group I think we've been struggling a bit more with and trying to pin down theoretically, at least. And that's also because this is a group that has been completely disregarded in Western countries. Essentially, all of the studies that I've cited previously, and also the Hamilton paper, they just drop all self-employed people or everyone who works in agricultural industries. We decided not to do that because it's a very important industry in the context, in particular in India, and there's lots of people employed in agriculture. But what makes this a little more difficult, at least for our follow-on mechanism checks, is that there are essentially different people who get caught up in the same group. There are a lot of people who look quite similar to the group that our argument so far has most largely applied to. So people for whom alternatives might be relatively precarious jobs, and people who just either like grow a few crops or are somewhat self-employed in minor agricultural tasks. But then you could conceive of this group reaching as far as full-fledged farmers who run whole farms and perhaps operate off of like larger premises and don't quite as neatly fall into a category where you can assign how precarious their alternative options might be. And then there's also the idea that's part of this, that they work in rural regions where alternative employment options might be in part even worse than in urban regions. And there's a seasonal nature to the employment that might complicate this account over the course of the whole year. And then this last group, and that's sort of the group on the right, is more similar to what I've been talking about so far. The general self-employed, these are more likely to be less educated compared to growth entrepreneurs and are less likely to open growth businesses or incorporate, and are very much caught up in what the argument about options and the precarity of alternative employment options has been focused on. So again, to think about this, if our argument is about options, then what we'll later return to is this idea of, when is the alternative most precarious? And that's when we'll also leverage things such as looking at the whole income distribution and the levels of education of these groups. But essentially, the one difference I want to highlight here, in particular, in comparison to Western context and the prior literature, is that we have good reason to assume that for the self-employed writ large, this bottom group of the rest of the self-employed, that we might find positive returns for them compared to, in contrast to the Western context. So to get at the data, I'm going to presume that most people here are somewhat familiar with the data. I'm going to breeze through this still in case people have worked with either other parts of the CMIE data or have only started working with them now. We're using data from the different parts of the Consumer Permits Household Survey. It's a high frequency longitudinal household survey that asks, and we primarily use questions that are related to general demographics, and then for our relationship of interest, questions about income and the type of employment. It's about 150,000 households per wave. We end up with a bit fewer in our data specifically in our sample. And we leverage 8 waves of the survey from 2017 through 2019. And this is because we're somewhat limited at the beginning because of certain questions about self-employment that were only asked starting in 2017. And then at the end, we don't want to get into COVID and therefore cap things off before then. Our variables of interest, the 2 main variables are essentially one that gets at entrepreneurship and one that gets at income. And so we do this in 2 different ways. And the first thing we do is we take all entrepreneurs and proxy for these using self-employment as the employment status indicating entrepreneurship, and compare the incomes of the self-employed to those who are in paid employment. And then for these subgroups that we look at separately, we distinguish between entrepreneurs who work in the agricultural sector, entrepreneurs who work in the agricultural sector, growth entrepreneurs, and the rest of the self-employed. And for these agricultural, we use the nature of occupation variable and include people who say they are self-employed and describe their occupation as being an agricultural laborer or farmer. Whereas for the growth entrepreneurs, we use this businessman category, which is defined as a person who owns and runs a proprietorship concern or is a partner in a partnership concern. And these are generally operating off of fixed premises and have invested more serious, larger levels of capital into their businesses. One thing that's important to note here is that people get asked about their employment status and whether they're self-employed or an entrepreneur at the time that the survey is conducted. But then the income, which is sort of the outcome variable for us, people get asked about retroactively, and they're asked for, like for all of the months since the prior survey, how much did they earn? And so we're much more interested in the effect of, like if you're an entrepreneur today versus are in paid employment today, then how much are you going to earn over the next few months? So as our dependent variable, we take the log of the average 4 months income that people report at the next survey. So it's essentially from the time that they're being asked about their employment status until the next survey, how much do they earn? And we take the individual income as the total income that people report from all sources and add the share of the household business income to this, as in we take the household business income and divide it by the number of self-employed people and then add it to them. And that's because the business income really only gets reported at the household level and not the individual level. And yeah, and again, this sort of gets at this short-term option value idea due to the fact that we only know whether a person is working in paid or self-employment today and don't know for each of the next 4 months for which we have the income what their exact employment status is. But sort of so within that is the idea that, you know, there might be short to medium term unemployment spells that are part of our estimate, but that's also what we're interested in. And we're interested in finding out whether self-employment or paid employment are less likely to incorporate these short-term unemployment spells and thereby affect earnings. All right, so looking at some raw data. This is the density distribution comparing incomes of the employed and all self-employed people. We have the people who start out in some form of paid employment. Note that this incorporates everybody who's in paid employment, i.e. people in casual daily wage work, casual or daily wage work, just as this includes people who work in salaried employment. And similarly, all self-employed includes all different types of self-employment. And this is, the distribution is somewhat capped so that it's more easily interpretable. But what we see here is essentially a picture that is flipped from this distribution that was found in Western countries when looking at hourly wage rates, right? So we see that the people who work in paid employment, that the meat of that distribution is actually to the left of those in self-employment, right? So that the median person in self-employment seems to earn more than the median person in paid employment. But at the right-hand tail of the distribution, at least sort of if we look at the 10.5 to 11 range, we see that there is a chunk of people in paid employment who earn more than do those in self-employment. And we also see this if we just look at some descriptive statistics. We here have the returns, the average monthly income by employment status. And on the top, the number shows the mean income, then underneath the standard deviation at the bottom in the square brackets, we have the median. And if we compare the employed people to all self-employed, we see that the self-employed earn more both at the mean and median. But then if we look into the different groups of the self-employed, we see that this is very much driven by people who are in growth entrepreneurship. And these earn vastly more than the other types of self-employment and people work in paid employment, with numbers that are almost double of what people in other types of self-employment are earning. And this is, we also see this when we look at the density distributions of the different types of self-employment. I know there's a lot of lines on here. Note that again, the solid line looks at the earnings of people who work in paid employment. And the main thing, I think the main thing to take away from this is that the agriculture and the other self-employed lines look at least somewhat comparable to what people in paid employment are earning. But the growth entrepreneurs are clearly, the distribution has shifted significantly to the right and they earn substantively more. Now, all of what I've been showing you so far have only been raw data, right? And there could obviously be other factors that predict both employment status as well as earnings. And so to do that, we started by taking a little bit of a look at descriptive statistics, and what I'm going to be showing you next is descriptive statistics by employment status. So here we see some relatively simple demographics comparing people in paid and self-employment, and we see that people who work in self-employment tend to be a little bit older. There's fewer women in self-employment. They tend to be a little less highly educated and be a little less likely to work in urban regions. If we look at sort of religion and caste levels, there's a few minor differences there, but they look somewhat more similar. And so this then is also what we're drawing from for our empirical approach. You know, like once we get to our regressions and more of the research design, And we have a relatively simple setup for this. The first thing to note is that the idea of this paper is relatively descriptive in nature. So we're not trying to make causal claims, and our setup is more to describe, like, what do the people who work in paid employment earn compared to people who work in self-employment, rather than getting too much at sort of an average randomized treatment effect. And our setup for this is based on coarse and exact matching, right? Which is this idea that you have that you match on coarse and categories of continuous variables, right? So for categorical variables, we match on these exactly, but if you have a continuous variable such as age, then you coarsen this into brackets. Let's say you take people who are like 30 to 35 and match them to somebody else who's in the 30 to 35 range. And the variables that we match on here in successive specifications are age, gender, education, and the survey wave to get the time dimension. And then we add the state in which they're in, whether they're in urban or rural region. And then also we match on religion and caste. Note also that we, in the paper, we have a little bit more on individual or two-way fixed effects models that we ran. Essentially, what we found and why we decided to stick with these models is that they are the more conservative estimator compared to different fixed effects approaches that one could take. Okay, so let's look at some returns. Let's look at some results. To orient you to the table, so what I'm going to be showing you here are OLS estimates of the effect of self-employment and the different self-employment categories in comparison to people who work in paid employment after doing the CEM matching. In the odd column, so what I'm going to be showing you first, we have the overall effect of self-employment, of all self-employed. And then the even columns, we're going to get at different subgroups. And the first two columns are without doing any matching, and then we successively match on the factors that I just outlined. The first thing to note is that just like in the raw data, we find that there are positive returns to entrepreneurship, positive returns to self-employment. And these are relatively large effect sizes, because remember, the dependent variable is the logged average monthly income, and we find that over the next 4 months. And we find that people who work in self-employment earn up to 40% more, up to 50% more if we take all self-employed. And when we divide this out into the different subgroups, we can see that all coefficients remain positive, and that for the growth entrepreneurs, the coefficient gets even larger, and that these earn up to about 130% of what comparable people in terms of age and education and state and urban status earn. So these are very large effect sizes. So the first thing that we did is we checked whether the coarseness, whether the way we went about our matching substantively affected these estimates and the results that we're getting. And so what this is showing you is essentially that the results are robust to the degree of coarseness. This is taking all of these, this is a coefficient plots. On the y-axis, we have the effect size, and these are just ordered by size. And so each coefficient, each little dot is a coefficient from a separately estimated model in which we matched on slightly different parameters and played around with the coarseness of age and education, and some of these match exactly on age, and so that you're only comparing the 39-year-old to another 39-year-old who both have the same years of education. And we find that these effect sizes are relatively stable, and we've also done this for the different subgroups, for the subtypes of entrepreneurs, as in the agricultural and the growth entrepreneurs. And for all of these, find, regardless of how we specify this, that results remain positive. Now, I'm not going to walk out of here leaving this 130% number as the final number. If you recall me talking about like there being high variance in the returns to entrepreneurship, it's important to keep in mind that what ordinarily squares regressions get at are mean returns, but if these are very skewed returns, then the median might be more interesting. So what I'm going to be showing you here on this slide are, we plot the coefficients for the different subgroups of entrepreneurs at each decile of the income distribution. So after having run quantile regressions, that is. And so then this is what these findings look like. There are a few important takeaways from this. The first one is that we continue to find positive returns at the median for all groups. The effects, however, are much smaller compared to what OLS specifications, the estimates that we get when we run OLS regressions. So compared to the 130% for growth entrepreneurs, here we find a 30% earnings premium for growth entrepreneurs compared to people who work in, similar people who work in paid employment. This is still following our matching procedure. And only a 7% premium for people for agricultural entrepreneurs, and a 3% for the rest of the self-employed, the other entrepreneurs. The other thing that is very hard to miss on the slide is that, at the very bottom end of the income distribution, the results, the estimated effect sizes are quite literally off the charts. And we find the very strongest returns at the bottom and at the 10th percentile of the income distribution. And so this is somewhat in line with our idea of there being the strongest, this idea of there being the strongest returns at the bottom end of the income distribution is somewhat in line with those people reaping the largest rewards from entrepreneurship that would be most affected by the precarity of alternative employment options. That said, I want to move on to show you some more evidence that is directly in line with a mechanism that we propose, the stability of income streams and the precarity of alternative employment options. And so we want to show you more evidence of this by first looking at month-by-month income data to directly get a sort of short-term unemployment spells. We have a little bit of data on hours worked. It isn't great, but I'm still going to briefly show that to you. And then the last couple of things we're going to look at are returns to education and what happens if we compare people not just to others who work in paid employment in general, but also look at people who are in salaried employment more specifically and divide out the type of paid employment. So for the first point, I think it would be important to recall the data structure, right? So we have the time of the interview at which we get the employment status, and then there's month-by-month income data. And so far we've averaged this, but something we can do is we can essentially proxy for unemployment spells using months in which somebody did not receive any income. Right. So the idea there being if somebody received an income of 0 over one of the months, they likely were unemployed for that month and had sort of a somewhat extended unemployment spell. So then we just come up with an indicator, a binary variable as the outcome variable that is like, did the person experience any full month without an income? Note that this is still somewhat conservative. It's a whole month. That is there could be even shorter, there likely are shorter unemployment spells that we're missing. And so then we predict the likelihood of any of these extended unemployment spells. Note that columns 1 and 2 show different results, right? So in column 1, we find a positive effect, the self-employed people being more likely, but in column 3, which uses individual fixed effects rather than a matching estimator, we find negative results. But we do find, if we stick to the matching models, that is columns 1 and 2, we do find that this positive effect is driven by people who are self-employed in the agricultural sector, and that for people who work in other self-employment and growth self-employment, there is this negative effect that is in line with our predictions. And so this might have something to do with the seasonal nature of agriculture. But also if we use individual fixed effects, then we find that for all people, self-employment leads to fewer extended unemployment spells over the next 4 months. So at least by and large, we interpret this as evidence that is somewhat in line with our idea of there being more stable income streams for the self-employed. A little bit, something else that gets at direct evidence is the question of how many hours people work, the self-employed work, whether they're able to work more hours than people in paid employment. And I want to give a short disclaimer. I don't think we're 100% sure if this question really measures what it's supposed to measure. And I'm saying that because the average response to this question is that people work 8 hours, but we know from other sources that the average person in India works fewer than 8 hours per day. So I think what this might be measuring is more, people might be recalling a day during which they worked and then responding to how many hours they worked on that day, rather than incorporating days into this average on which they didn't work at all. Also, this question was only asked in the last wave of the sample that we're using, so we only have cross-sectional data. And by and large, we find sort of a similar pattern as before, namely that the agricultural entrepreneurs are somewhat of an outlier, and they respond to working fewer hours in a day. But the other two groups of entrepreneurs are sort of more present evidence, more in line with our idea and our mechanism, and they report to working more hours in a day. The next thing I want to talk to you about is sort of about the returns to entrepreneurship by education. And again, this sort of gets at this idea of what are your alternatives and how precarious are your alternative options. And so the idea here is sort of, the question is who's most likely to have stable and salaried employment as an alternative? It's probably those who are most highly educated. And so this is one of the driving mechanisms of these positive returns that we're finding. Then what we should expect is the lowest returns actually at the highest level of education. And so what we do for this is we interact the self-employment coefficient for all self-employed, and we don't really get into the subgroups, by the education level. And we find evidence that is somewhat similar, that is somewhat in line with this. Again, people who don't have a primary education, if they stick out a little bit, but what we find and what is in line with our idea is that people who have some college education, either an undergraduate or a postgraduate education, are the groups with the lowest returns to entrepreneurship. And in fact, for people with a postgraduate education, the 95% confidence intervals land pretty much exactly at 0. So we're almost in the realm of losing statistical significance by, classic code definitions of it. So again, this is a little bit more in line with this idea that the more stable your alternative employment options are, the lower your relative returns to entrepreneurship. So then the last thing, and this is more direct evidence of this that I want to take a look at, is comparing people not just to everyone in paid employment, but separating these out also by how stable their income streams are. So we have some more detailed information on this. So we know whether people are engaging daily wage work, or in temporary salary employment, or in salaried, more permanent positions. And that is, if you're in a more permanent salaried position, that is more stable, and therefore, if we compare people, this should decrease the relative returns of entrepreneurship compared to the other more precarious paid employment options. We do this in two different ways, and the first one, I'm going to talk about the first one first. So here we just essentially separate this out and compare all the different employment statuses to people who work in daily wage work in column 1. And what we find here, unsurprisingly, is that people who engage in salaried work earn a lot more than people who engage in daily wage work. In fact, they earn more than people who engage in agricultural and other forms of the general self-employment entrepreneurship categories. But people who engage in growth entrepreneurship continue to far and away out-earn all other groups. the second way we do this, and here what we're trying to do is somewhat take out the precarity of earnings and get closer to an hour by hour wage comparison, right? So we obviously can't really get an hour by hour comparison, but what we're doing is, since we know what people earn for each month, we're taking out all of the months in which they reported zero earnings. So essentially, we're trying to remove some of this precarity and some of the unemployment spells to see if that is what's driving these strong positive returns. And so once we remove these, we find that some of these coefficients drop significantly. In fact, now people who are in salaried employment report we find the strongest estimates for this group of people. They report the highest earnings once we remove some of the instability of employment and of the labor market. They earn even more than growth entrepreneurs in this setting, and substantively more than the other types of entrepreneurs. And this is to underline the point that a large part of this positive earnings premium that we find for the self-employed is driven by extended spells of unemployment that can be avoided for people in self-employment. And so what we can't really rule out then is that all of this earnings gap is solely driven by more stable income streams, and that if we were to compare hour by hour earnings, it might very well be that people in all kinds of paid employment earn more on average than people who work in self-employment. And essentially, this is where I want to leave things. And I just want to highlight a couple of takeaways again. So first, we found positive short-term returns at the mean and median to entrepreneurship in India, and we found that these are largely driven by more stable income streams and people who engage in self-employment being less affected by the precarity of the labor market and the precarity of alternative employment options. And a couple of things that we want to highlight here is that these are just like if we're thinking about this from more of a policy perspective, these are economically significant results. Like I said, there's about 200 million people in India who engage in self-employment. So this is, we believe, an important question to tackle just purely from this aspect. But then also this highlights some of the assumptions that the Western literature has made in thinking about how to study returns to entrepreneurship, and that there are extensions of this that might even be relevant that might be relevant for Western context, because not everybody in Western or richer countries experiences these stable alternative employment options. And we could think about people due to various reasons, whether it be discrimination or injuries, struggle to find stable employment options. And for these people, even in other and richer contexts, entrepreneurship might be the more profitable option. And I think this is where I want to leave things. Thank you so much. We appreciate and look forward to any other questions or comments. And yeah, and if anything else comes up after, please feel free to email me or reach out any other way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoffrey. That was an excellent presentation and threw a lot of light on a subject which I think is very important and very relevant to India, because entrepreneurship is often touted by the establishment over here as necessary to solve India's employment problems. And there have been discussions, many of them in the past, not as rigorous as this exercise that you have done, whether self-employment is actually disguised unemployment or not. So I think your rigorous piece of work will go a long way to contributing to this. But I would like Maurizio to come in over here. And before that, Olav, would you like to say anything before we head over to Maurizio?
No, I mean, I think that Jeff did a great job presenting it. I've been just trying to keep up with the questions that have been coming in the Q&A.
You've done a great job there. You have two outstanding for you. So, Maurizio, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I am, there's always a little moment of panic when one has to start sharing the screen, but I hope you can, it works fine. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for sharing the paper. And thank you for the clear presentation. I have to follow up with some discussion on this. Let me make a short intro that I'm not an expert in entrepreneurship per se, but I have worked with these data and I have struggled with a very closely related question. So my comments are a little bit maybe not as completely central and in sync with the literature that you see, but I think I can provide a view that will potentially broaden the interest of your paper. So that's the hope. So let me start by saying that this is a very interesting paper, and with a creative use of the CNI surveys data. So definitely I understand that the interest of Maesh and team to have this paper in their series, and it's a testament also to the usefulness of this data set. So I like particularly the emphasis of the paper on the heterogeneity of what I call the informal sector, which is this emphasis on the nature of work, of economic engagement of individuals and small firms and up to large firms is varied in the context of India, and it's really important to be able to appreciate that and look at that in the data. This is indeed also a crucial topic, that of informality, because the self-employed, the very short tenured wage worker are indeed a large share of the economy. And that's a major development issue, since informality is often associated with low labor productivity, limited access to capital, access to technology, and therefore lower growth. Is also associated with poor working condition and vulnerability, so to topics of inequality. And in the end, is also associated with the capacity of the government to have a larger tax base. So crucial topic that you're looking at. And indeed, you provide an interesting quantitative empirical measurements on these returns to entrepreneurship. My areas of, so kudos on all those points. My comments are on three main areas. One is a little, and the most important thing is on the conceptual framework, then some issues on definition and measurements that you have touched upon already, and then the final area is what do we do with this? What are the policy implications, if any? Okay, on the conceptual framework, let me digress for a second and mention the following. That I come more from a development economics perspective, and the literature on informality that that we have available is basically polarized into two opposing views. The first view is that informal firms choose to remain small and avoid formal regulation and taxation. They have certain characteristics intrinsic to them, limited business skills, essentially low productivity, that makes them, their formalization not so compelling, and the fact that they have to pay taxes or compel with regulation will make them uncompetitive. So they actually choose to remain small and informal. And there's quite a bit of literature on this. I cite here Santiago Levy and Bill Maloney that look at this, especially from the for the Latin American countries. The second view is opposite to that. Is that it's not really, the problem is not really with informal firms, but it's in the formal sector. And there are barriers to entry in the form of regulation and above market wage benefit to a relatively small group of insiders. So it's the outsider insiders, or the dualistic perspective, and that these barriers leave a large group of outsiders in the formal sector. Exponents of this, Simon Jankov and others, originating from the work of the Soto. Now, these two views have really opposite policy implication. The first view as we need to do something about informality. Informality is a problem. The origin of the problem is within informality, so we need to take care of that. The other one is we need to liberalize. The problem is these barriers, deregulation. So they have clear cut views. Now, this paper seem to start, although it doesn't discuss the issue in this framework, but seems to have a view that individuals look at options and choose whatever is best for them. And so it implicitly adopts the first view, or at least that's what I think it does. And I suggest that perhaps it would be good to try to link up a little bit that your literature with this debate to broaden the interest and the people who will find the paper useful. In particular, I cite here the example from another Maloney et al. Paper that shows clearly that in the case of Mexico, the self-employed are self-employed because they follow an opportunity, and they are choosing to be self-employed. And this is because they measure the transitions from formal wage to self-employed, and they find that when there is pro-cyclicality, when the economic activity expands, they move there. So it's not that they are becoming self-employed because there are no other options, but it's actually they're maximizing their returns by going there during the pro-cyclicality. So this is a demonstration that there is a choice. Okay, so but it's possible that it's not always the case, and there are other ways that people allocate or are allocated across different occupations, and it's not a calculation of the best option, the best value of my option, but it's just a rationing or a queuing. So there are other approaches to consider that. So, but if we for a moment forget about this debate and say, okay, Indeed, there is an option. There is a choice that individual make in terms of employment status that maximize their returns on their characteristics. Then the problem becomes, what are these opportunities? What are these the options that people evaluate and can choose from? And in the wording of the paper, this is also called sometimes the counterfactual. Now, to determine what is the most, the closest counterfactual to the current employment status of an individual, the paper, the authors choose the matching approach, and it is clearly intuitive. We want to compare a person that is self-employed to a person that is mostly similar to the self-employed, but is in a different employment occupation category, mainly a wage worker, and we see whether there is a difference in the way that they in their earnings, and so that's the measurement. But there are I see two issues with this approach. One is that we can only match, and this is probably an easy comment that you may have already received. You can only match on observables, but in the literature, there are a lot of non-observable that are making individuals, pushing individuals towards their the choices that they make in terms of starting a business. We know a bit about that. But then the other, and I'm not sure what you can do about that. But so sorry about making this comment, but it's an easy comment. But the other one is that I'm still a little bit unconvinced about the fact that the counterfactual should be really someone so close to what you are now. And there's an example. There's a discussion on page 19 about when you show the series of columns of your matching, when you match on more and more characteristics, when you start matching a bit, for example, on location areas, urban versus rural. And so you are now comparing self-employed in rural to whoever is non-self-employed, whoever is a wage worker in rural, and you say, okay, but there are very few wage workers in rural areas. So obviously, the returns to self-employment in rural areas go up when I control for rural, because the alternative is really bad and few. So, but is that the right way to define the return to entrepreneurship in rural areas? Because you're comparing to a group that is small, that there are not very many options. So I don't know. I'm not sure that that's the best way. And why not considering migration? Why not considering opportunity? Why a lot of rural farmers, rather than considering dropping their self-employed, the small plot, and finding a wage work in the rural area, they consider going to the city. And so, and if going to the city is once you discount for the cost of migration and everything other utility, if the returns to the city are much higher, then your return, your entrepreneurship value returns in the farming, the rural area is not that high anymore. So so that's my comment on that. In terms of methods, there's this. I suggest you cite another paper of the Mel, McKenzie, and Woodruff that measure the return to capital in small micro enterprises. I think it's still in Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken. But there is another paper by the Mel, McKenzie, and Woodruff that look at who are the micro entrepreneur and enterprises owners, and they have a fairly interesting method approach there, which rather than trying to measure the returns as you do, they try to figure out how to distinguish in this large group of self-employed own account workers, which have potential to become entrepreneurs and which are instead waiting to get a wage work and type of employment. And so rather than looking at the returns to entrepreneurship and wage workers as they currently are, they look at the intrinsic characteristics of this large group of workers and place them in the spectrum between wage work and entrepreneurship entrepreneurs. So I think it's very related to your work and worthwhile having a look. So that's on the conceptual framework. As I said, it's a bit tangential. It's not exactly the same approaches but I think if you talk to that literature, you will have a very larger, even larger audience among development economists. In terms of definitions and measurement issues, so a bit of a reiteration here that your category, although you distinguish the self-employed between different groups, you kind of call a little bit every self-employed entrepreneur, but I suggest that you shift a little bit that, and it's a bit difficult to be convinced that what you are, your self-employed other category, the residual, that non-farmer and non-growth entrepreneurs are really entrepreneurs. They are these small shop owners, taxi drivers, as well as a wide variety of mostly informal micro enterprises, citing from your paper. I've seen them really owners or manager of a business, or that they are innovators is a bit of a stretch, to be honest. So that's on definition of that. So I reiterate here that the issue is actually distinguishing in this mass who has potential to become entrepreneur, who hasn't. The other the measurement issues that I suggest you do some robustness checks is this long-term versus short-term. You mentioned that you fix the status, the employment status, and then you look at whether anything changes in the next 4 months, if I'm not mistaken. It's still, but in another place of the paper, you mentioned that there is the average spell of entrepreneurship is 2.9 waves. I forgot now what is the translation of a wave in terms of months. Is that longer, shorter? So why don't do your results, in other words, do your results change if you go beyond the 4 months or shorter of the 4 months? In general, one of the problem of India and South Asia is that firms tend not to expand in size. They are much slower to expand in size, apart from the churning that you mentioned at the beginning of the paper. So it takes a much longer time than in the US to double in size, much longer. So there's literature on that. So a little bit of a stance in the paper of why you choose the short term, why you choose 4 months, if anything changes if you shift on that. Finally, on measurement, you are always using these individual income and household level income that you allocate across the participant in the adults in the household. But this income is a mix of returns to various factors, and so you mentioned in your paper that you sometimes exclude interest and dividends, nothing changes, but it's still fairly contentious to compare really wage workers who are paid only for their labor inputs and anyone else who gets who has incomes that are originating from different set of factors. Okay, so the final my final comment is on the policy implications. So where do we go? Where do you go from here? You have a bit of a discussion towards the end of the paper, and I understand that as you said, Geoffrey, your contribution is mainly descriptive, but working in an international organization such as the World Bank, I'm always hammered really hard. So what? Why are you telling me all of this? So you have a bit of a discussion there, and your key implication is that, following from the fact that, okay, it seems that entrepreneurship is a safe option because you get a steadier flows of income. So maybe support entrepreneurship is what a policymaker should do. And by the way, it is also helpful at the bottom of the distribution. So you don't need to worry about targeting. That's what I read from your final parts of the paper. I see a few issues here. First one is that the bottom part of the distribution is indeed the graph that you show. There is a very high off the chart bar, as you mentioned, but you caution in the paper that this is a premium. This is vis-a-vis a base that is really small. If the base is 0, anything, it becomes a premium of infinity, clearly, right? So is this enough to raise people out of poverty? I don't know. It's a premium, so you don't give the basis, but that's the warning that you have. Second, yes, you go a long way in the paper and convincingly that when compared with intermittent wage work, the premium is high. But do we really want to bypass the issues about intermittent wage work? Are we sure that if we go all the way to entrepreneurship, there will be, these entrepreneurs will create enough employment so that the problem that we have to begin with, the intermittent wage worker, will go away? It's not so clear that is the way. And I have a graph here that shows you that for Latin America, from a publication that we put out some time back, a lot of informal workers are actually hired by the formal firms. So even the formal firms, those who are employing people, are creating some of the problem of intermittent, because they are employing, here you see in the columns of, if you look at the bottom, India, these are percentages of workers, and you have workers classified as informal and formal, and then you have the rows that are formal firms, informal firms, and households. So you see that in the column of informal, who are, by the way, 88% of total workers, but actually 7.7% of these 88 are employed by formal firms. So even the formal firms are employing, probably for maximizing profits, are employing on an informal basis without any contracts workers. So they are themselves creating some of the problem of intermittent wage work. So I'm a little bit concerned that we, by emphasizing too much on entrepreneurship is the solution, we may not really resolve the initial problem. And finally, indeed, yes, there is a large literature that supporting entrepreneurship at scale may be prohibitively costly. So in any case, some targeting, and that's the Mail McKenzie Woodruff paper, that they try to identify more clearly who in the mass of the own account workers as potential or not, is so some targeting maybe. Anyway, I'm done with my comments. I enjoy tremendously the paper, and I have one last thing that we may continue on a bilateral basis, is women. What is the role of gender in all of this? If you have had any look on that would be very interesting. But thank you very much. Nice. I stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments, Maurizio. They are highly appreciated and very well taken. And I think, yeah, some of them get at points that we've been thinking about a little bit. Others get at points that sort of have been the difficulty in setting up this paper. I'm thinking in particular about your comments in the conceptual framework, and we've been cautiously thinking about which literatures to speak to, as you know, we try and walk the line between writing a paper that we want out there and not drawing reviewers who are unfamiliar with our approach or our parts of the literature, and balancing talking to development economists and other people who are from the entrepreneurship literature and other niches of the entrepreneurship literature even. I very much, I like your point about sort of like what we match on affecting the comparisons we make. And I think it's also something that we've been wrestling with a little bit. Our approach so far is essentially, and that's in large part also why we show all of these different matching estimates and end up with our coefficient plots, to just also have some in which we don't control for certain things. And it might be worthwhile for us to take another look, instead of just like lining them up and showing the broad swath, to dive a little more deeply into, okay, like for which specifications do we find stronger versus weaker effect sizes, and take another look to make sure that we didn't miss any patterns there. But yeah, it's sort of, I'd have to think about empirically, like what we'd want to do if we wanted to get more at migration, or if there's a way to really incorporate that more strongly. Yeah, I think some other points of yours are well taken, and I agree with your caution and nuanced take on our takeaways. And I think I've also been very careful to not, in the past, to not push super strong policy recommendations, which is obviously more the world that you're from. And I agree that it's sort of a very small premium. And I think the difficulty here is, once you start talking about policy recommendations, then you rightly bring in this point of essentially like follow-on effects and like who might they employ and might they grow. And that is, I think, truly outside of the scope of this paper and speaks much more to other work in development economics, whereas all we can talk about as best we can is the individual, and whether the individual entrepreneur might be better off compared to like a narrow set of alternative options. And so the follow-on, let's call them social welfare effects, might deserve a slightly different approach of studying. But also a lot of your other points are very well taken, and I think some that we'll have to spend some time thinking about and trying to see how to incorporate them into the front end. And the empirics are this discussion surrounding who is an entrepreneur is one that comes up frequently, and people have very strong opinions on in lots of different directions, and so it's been a fun one to deal with, but you certainly raised some valid points, and all of them are highly appreciated, and we appreciate you taking a look.
Yeah, let me just add my thanks, Maurizio, to engaging with the paper. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Many of these things we had thought about. I would completely agree with your kind of comments on the matching, which is part of the reasons why we match on many different things, is trying to think about, what do we want to adjust for versus what should we consider as potentially malleable, such as the relocation. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we're, we've in the tables, we're reporting, kind of 4 or 5 different matching approaches. And then we actually have this, kind of subsequent analysis where we have, another, kind of half dozen matching approaches to see how sensitive the results are to the matching choices. I don't think we're going to resolve the question of who an entrepreneur is. That's been a massive debate in the literature. There's certainly one extreme which thinks that the only entrepreneurs are those that are, doing tech-based VC-backed investment, to the other extreme being, kind of anyone who's self-employed. We're obviously taking a stance that's closer to the anyone self-employed, and we're aware of that. I will say there's a couple of things that I found really interesting, because I think that, we're coming at this from this literature on returns to entrepreneurship. And there's a couple of things that occurred to me that are kind of norms in that literature that we hadn't really, I think, thought about as deeply as we should. And the one in particular is, you had this point about differences in returns to different types of capital, right? So you're absolutely right that some of these businesses actually have financial capital investments, or maybe have land, and part of what we're basically aggregating, the returns to all of that when we're making these estimates. That has been the norm in this literature, and so that's kind of why we've approached it that way. But I don't think people have even thought explicitly about the fact that they're doing that aggregation. And so I think that I'm not sure if we can parse it out. I don't think that we have. I'm not sure if we have good enough information about the financial capital investments to figure out, kind of what might be the returns to each component. But at the very least, we should be explicit about the fact that certain types of businesses here are aggregating these returns not just to labor, but also to capital. So, thank you once again for the comments, and we may, if you're open to it, come back to you with some questions. Thank you.
You're muted, Mahesh. You're muted. Sorry.
Thank you, Maurizio. I appreciate prompting me on that. But I was saying thank you. This has been a wonderful session. a great presentation and very pointed, very interesting observations by Maurizio. All I will say is that Geoffrey and Olav, if you revise your paper, feel free to send it to us. We'll put revised versions on the site again, and we are happy to connect you with the people who have sent you questions. If you are interested, we will put them in touch with you. And this whole session will be available on YouTube for people who could not attend at this time. Also, the transcripts of questions and answers will also be available. So we will be in touch, and thank you all of you very much for being a part of this. We have completely run out of time. It is 8:30 over here. We've been in the session for 90 minutes. I think this is pretty good. Thank you, Olav. Thank you, Geoffrey, and thank you, Maurizio, very much.
Thank you, Mahesh.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Good evening.
All the
Bye.
best. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.